she was talking about, she's English, and I mean, why should she be so protective of the quality, you know, the standard of the aficionados of Raymond Chandler? I don't know.
So, when the stories surrounding Robert Mitchum's extraordinary life finally came to light, few could have imagined how strange some of them would sound. Behind the rugged image and effortless charm was a man whose Hollywood experiences often seemed unbelievable to be true. From unexpected encounters and rebellious moments to behind-the-scenes stories that challenged the legend audiences thought they knew, each revelation painted a far more complicated picture of the iconic actor. But which stories about Mitchum were actually true? And what did people discover when they finally looked beyond the Hollywood image? Number 1, the boy whose life begins with tragedy. So Robert Mitchum's story begins with a tragedy that happened before he was even old enough to understand what he had lost. Born in 1917, Robert was still a toddler when his father, James Thomas Mitchum, died in a railroad accident while working as a switchman at the Charleston Navy Yard in South Carolina. Suddenly, his mother, Anne Harriet, was left to raise a young family while also expecting another child. Life became a struggle almost immediately. Anne found work to support the family, while relatives helped care for the children as they moved between different places. Robert grew up without the steady presence of a father, and that difficult beginning was an important part of the man he eventually became. As Robert entered his teenage years, however, he proved difficult to control. He was intelligent, but he had little patience for authority. He argued with teachers, challenged school rules, and repeatedly found himself in trouble. Eventually, he was expelled from school. For Robert, the classroom seemed to offer very little, but the outside world offered something very different. During the Great Depression, he began drifting across America, taking whatever work he could find and learning how to survive without the comfort or security most teenagers had. He worked, traveled, struggled, and encountered people and situations that forced him to grow up quickly. These were not glamorous adventures. They were difficult years that exposed him to poverty, loneliness, danger, and uncertainty. Yet those experiences would later become part of what made Mitchum such a convincing screen presence. Long before Hollywood discovered his famous face and unmistakable voice, Robert had already lived through enough hardship to understand fear, desperation, rebellion, and survival. But there was one moment that would make his unusual childhood even more remarkable. So, Robert's life began with a tragedy too heavy for a boy his age. But what bigger struggles awaited him as he grew, and how did he cope with them? Now let's dive into the next touching chapter of Robert's story. Number 2, a walk into the Great Depression. Now, this is where Robert Mitchum's teenage years became almost unbelievable. At around 14, Robert left home during the Great Depression, but the story was more complicated than a rebellious teenager simply deciding to disappear. According to accounts of his life, his mother packed his suitcase and even prepared food for the journey. From there, Robert began moving across America, often relying on freight trains and temporary jobs to get by. He picked fruit, dug ditches, washed dishes, and took whatever work he could find. There was no steady paycheck, comfortable home, or clear plan for the future. He was learning survival the hard way. And then came boxing. As a young man, Mitchum competed in professional bouts, stepping into the ring and taking real punishment for money. Those fights added another layer to the toughness he would later bring to the screen. But his travels exposed him to much more than physical hardship. He encountered railroad workers, drifters, police officers, jail cells, and people struggling to survive on the edges of society. These experiences gave him a view of America that most teenagers never had. Years later, Hollywood audiences would see Mitchum's famous, relaxed expression and assume it meant he was simply too cool to care. But perhaps there was more behind that look. Before he became a movie star, Robert had already experienced hunger, uncertainty, hard labor, violence, and loneliness. He had learned to stay calm because life had given him plenty of reasons not to. And then, while he was still a teenager, his wandering journey took a frightening turn. Robert arrived in Georgia with little money and nowhere to call home. Here's what happened. Because of Robert's difficult nature, his mother eventually sent him away. But what awaited him in Georgia? Could he turn his life around, or would an even more devastating chapter begin? Let's uncover the painful details. Number 3, the teenage fugitive who escaped a chain gang. Here's where Robert Mitchum's teenage story begins to sound almost unbelievable. In the early 1930s, while he was still a teenager, Mitchum was arrested in Georgia on a vagrancy charge and sent to a chain gang. For a young man who had already spent years traveling across America, this was a frightening new reality. The work was harsh, the conditions were difficult, and Mitchum later carried physical reminders of injuries he suffered during that period. But he refused to let the experience end his journey. While working on a road detail, Mitchum found an opportunity to escape. He eventually made his way back toward his family, but what happened in Georgia stayed with him for the rest of his life. Think about what he had already experienced before Hollywood even knew his name. He had faced poverty, homelessness, dangerous jobs, professional boxing, jail, and years of uncertainty on the road. Most people would have struggled under even one of those experiences. Mitchum had lived through all of them. That scary history became part of what made his screen presence so convincing. Hollywood could give him tough guy roles, but Mitchum never had to pretend he understood danger. He had already encountered it in real life. Years later, when he returned to Georgia to film Cape Fear, the memories of his teenage years were still part of his past. His performance as Max Cady carried a level of anger and menace that felt almost disturbingly natural. But surviving his youth was not the biggest storm Mitchum would face. By the late 1940s, he had become a major Hollywood star. Then one night, police arrived at a house in Los Angeles and arrested him. So, as a teenager, Robert was arrested and sent to a chain gang long before police later arrived at a house in Los Angeles. But what would this second encounter with the police reveal? Would he simply be questioned, or would he face serious consequences for what they uncovered? Let's find out. Number 4, the Hollywood scandal involving Robert. By 1948, Robert Mitchum had already become one of Hollywood's rising stars. Then, almost overnight, his carefully built career was thrown into chaos. Police arrested Mitchum after finding him with marijuana at a house in Los Angeles. The story quickly spread across newspapers, turning a private incident into a national scandal. For a major movie star, the consequences could have been devastating. Mitchum was convicted and served time, while Hollywood watched to see whether the controversy would destroy him. Studios had every reason to distance themselves from an actor who had suddenly become a public relations problem. But something unexpected happened. Instead of disappearing, Mitchum remained in the spotlight. RKO released one of his films, while the scandal was still fresh, and audiences continued going to see him. The controversy had not ended his career. If anything, it added another layer to the mysterious, rebellious image that was already developing around him. Years later, the conviction was overturned after questions were raised about the circumstances surrounding the arrest. But the story had another painful side. The young actress arrested alongside Mitchum faced far more damaging consequences to her career. While Mitchum eventually returned to major Hollywood productions, her career never recovered in the same way. The episode exposed an uncomfortable reality about Hollywood. Two people could be involved in the same scandal and still face completely different consequences, depending on their position, reputation, and power. Mitchum survived the controversy, and remarkably, he went on to deliver one of the performances that would define his entire career. The strange part? The film was initially misunderstood, struggled with audiences, and was considered a failure. Robert was arrested alongside another actress, and both faced jail time before eventually being released. But could Robert still make an impact despite such a dark chapter? And if he tried, would Hollywood recognize his talent and give him another chance? Let's uncover the next story. Number 5, the movie that became a masterpiece. Now, this is one of the strangest turns in Robert Mitchum's career. In 1955, Mitchum took on one of his most unforgettable roles in The Night of the Hunter, directed by Charles Laughton. He played Reverend Harry Powell, a terrifying preacher whose hands carried the words love and hate across his knuckles. Today, the film is regarded as a classic and one of the most distinctive movies in American cinema. But when it was first released, audiences did not know what to make of it. The movie performed poorly, and the disappointment hit Laughton especially hard. He never directed another feature film afterward. Mitchum, however, saw something different. He considered his performance as Powell one of the finest of his career. And behind the scenes, he showed a side of himself that completely challenged the image Hollywood had created around him. Mitchum was famous for appearing lazy, careless, and completely uninterested. But during The Night of the Hunter, he became much more involved in the production than people might have expected. Laughton was uncomfortable directing the young actors, so Mitchum helped guide the children through their scenes and worked with them during filming. Think about that. The man Hollywood often portrayed as someone who could barely be bothered to care was quietly helping make an important part of the movie work. Laston also saw beyond the tough guy image. He believed Mitchum was intelligent, thoughtful, well-mannered, and far more capable than he allowed people to see. And perhaps that was the real mystery surrounding Robert Mitchum. The public saw a man who seemed indifferent to everything, but underneath that image was someone deeply curious, creative, and surprisingly intellectual. So, Robert, known for his tough and indifferent nature, was able to calmly guide his younger co-stars through a movie that eventually became a success. But could a deeper story have shaped this side of him? And what experience taught Robert the true meaning of compassion? Let's uncover the emotional story. Number 6, the tough guy who suffered a hidden breakdown. Now, this reveals a side of Robert Mitchum that his famous tough guy image rarely showed. Long before audiences knew him as the calm, heavy-lidded actor who seemed impossible to intimidate, Mitchum was simply a young man trying to survive. During his early working years, he reportedly took a job at Lockheed Aircraft Corporation as a machine operator. It sounded like another ordinary job for a young man who had already worked his way through countless difficult situations. But the environment was anything but ordinary. The machinery was extremely loud, and Mitchum reportedly suffered serious hearing damage while working there. That alone would have been difficult enough. But his problems did not stop there. Mitchum reportedly experienced a severe stress-related breakdown and even temporary problems with his vision. And this is where his story becomes especially fascinating. The man who would later build an entire career around appearing relaxed, detached, and almost impossible to disturb was dealing with pressures that could have broken someone much earlier in life. Yet Mitchum kept moving. He worked different jobs. He searched for opportunities. And eventually, he found his way into Hollywood. Audiences would later see the effortless confidence, the slow voice, and that famous expression that made him look as though nothing in the world could bother him. But perhaps that image was never the complete truth. Behind the calm exterior was a man who had already experienced poverty, dangerous work, physical hardship, and serious personal struggles. And maybe that was part of what made Robert Mitchum so convincing on screen. He wasn't simply pretending to be tough. He had already learned how to survive when life became difficult. Unbelievably, Robert, known for his tough and indifferent nature, calmly guided younger actors through a movie that eventually became a success. But could he take on any role and deliver, or was he selective about the projects he accepted? Let's explore Robert's next story. Number 7, the star who turned down. 2 iconic roles. Here's where Robert Mitchum's famous "I don't care" image begins to fall apart. For years, Hollywood presented Mitchum as the kind of man who seemed uninterested in almost everything. But his career choices told a very different story. There were roles he deliberately refused, including 2 parts that would later become legendary: Patton and Dirty Harry. Mitchum reportedly turned down Patton because he did not believe he was the right person for the role. Instead, he suggested George Scott, who eventually accepted the part and won the Academy Award for his performance. Then came Dirty Harry. Again, Mitchum walked away. This time, his concern was with the story itself. He reportedly disliked the movie's approach to justice and its celebration of a violent form of law enforcement. That decision is revealing. These were not insignificant projects that Mitchum could easily forget. They became major films that shaped the careers of the actors who accepted them. Mitchum could have taken either role and possibly added another major achievement to his resume, but he chose not to. Why? Because beneath the relaxed attitude was a man who clearly had strong opinions about the stories he wanted to tell. He also rejected other projects when he felt their portrayal of real experiences was not believable. That suggests Mitchum was not careless about his career. He was selective. He simply didn't feel the need to explain every decision he made, and perhaps that was one reason audiences misunderstood him for so long. But there was another side to Mitchum that was even harder to reconcile with his tough guy image. Acting wasn't his only creative passion. He wrote, composed music, and eventually stepped into a recording studio. The Hollywood tough guy who appeared to care about nothing was also a recording artist. But instead of making ordinary pop records, Mitchum became fascinated by a completely different sound. Astonishingly, Robert turned down several movie projects, some of which eventually became major successes. But is there a story that reveals he was finally accepted for who he truly was? And how did he react when he was honored by the very school that once expelled him? Let's uncover the intriguing story. Number 8. Robert was invited by the school that expelled him. So, this is one of the strangest twists in Robert Mitchum's early life. Long before Hollywood knew his name, Mitchum had already developed a reputation as the kind of teenager schools struggled to handle. He was intelligent, rebellious, and fiercely independent, but he had very little patience for rules or authority. His behavior eventually became serious enough that he was expelled from school. At the time, nobody looking at that troubled teenager could have imagined where his life would eventually lead. There was no obvious sign that he would become one of America's most recognizable movie stars. Instead, Mitchum seemed to be heading in the opposite direction. Then, decades later, something unexpected happened. The same educational system that had once decided Mitchum was too difficult to keep in the classroom eventually recognized him with a diploma. Think about how strange that must have been. The teenager who had been shown the door had grown into an internationally known actor. The boy who had struggled to follow school rules had built a career that made him famous around the world. But Mitchum, reportedly, did not treat the moment like a grand homecoming. When he was allowed to attend the graduation ceremony, he chose not to appear. Instead, the diploma was eventually mailed to him. There is something almost poetic about that ending. The school had once decided Robert Mitchum did not belong there. By the time it recognized him, he had already created a life far beyond the classroom. And perhaps the most interesting question is what really happened between those two moments. Was Mitchum simply a rebellious teenager who eventually became lucky? Or did the same independence, stubbornness, and refusal to follow the crowd that made him difficult as a student become the qualities that helped him survive poverty, hardship, and eventually Hollywood? Maybe the boy who could not fit into the classroom was never meant to follow an ordinary path. Beyond the honor Robert received from the school that once expelled him, what was his family life really like? Did he build a lasting family despite his tough nature? Or did he remain a lonely man? Let's explore Robert's family story. Number 9. The marriage that lasted for 57 years. Now, this part of Robert Mitchum's story reveals a side of him that Hollywood rarely showed. Mitchum met Dorothy Spence while he was still young and recovering from injuries. Their relationship eventually became one of the longest-lasting marriages connected to a major Hollywood star of his generation. They married in 1940, when Mitchum was still building his life and had not yet become the famous actor audiences would eventually know. And remarkably, they stayed married for 57 years. Of course, their marriage was not perfect. Like many long relationships, it faced serious challenges. Mitchum had documented affairs, including his well-known relationship with actress Shirley MacLaine during the 1960s. Yet despite those difficulties, Mitchum and Dorothy remained together. They raised 3 children, James, Christopher, and Petrine, and their family eventually became connected to the entertainment business as well. At times, Mitchum and his family also worked together professionally. That long marriage adds another layer to the mystery surrounding Robert Mitchum. The public often saw him as detached, unpredictable, and almost impossible to pin down. He built a career around looking like a man who needed nobody. But privately, he maintained a family relationship that lasted for more than half a century. Whatever disagreements and problems they faced, Dorothy remained part of his life through his rise from struggling young man to Hollywood star. By the final years of Mitchum's life, she was still one of the people closest to him. When Robert Mitchum died in 1997 at the age of 79, Dorothy was at his side. And even in death, Mitchum stayed true to the unusual personality he had carried throughout his life. He had no interest in a grand Hollywood spectacle or a dramatic farewell. He wanted something simple. What happened after his death reflected exactly the kind of private, understated life he had always preferred. Astonishingly, despite Robert's tough nature, he remained married for 57 years until his death. But what surprising story emerged after his passing? And what does his life reveal about the man behind the tough guy image? Let's uncover the complicated details. Number 10. The man who wanted no Hollywood funeral. By the 1990s, Robert Mitchum had already built a career most actors could only dream about. He had appeared in more than 100 films. He had survived poverty, prison, scandal, professional setbacks, and changing Hollywood trends. He had become one of cinema's most recognizable tough guys, while simultaneously hiding an intellectual and creative side that few people expected. Then, in 1997, Mitchum died at his home in Santa Barbara at the age of 79 after battling lung cancer and emphysema. But even in death, he refused to behave like a conventional Hollywood legend. Mitchum did not want a traditional memorial service. His body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered at sea. His family later placed a cenotaph near the Delaware Cemetery connected to an important chapter of his youth. And perhaps that ending was perfectly suited to Robert Mitchum. He spent his entire life resisting simple explanations. Hollywood called him lazy, but he worked for decades. People called him indifferent. Yet he wrote poetry, composed music, made records, and cared deeply about the roles he accepted. They called him a tough guy. But behind the tough exterior was a man shaped by poverty, loss, hardship, literature, music, family, and personal principles. Robert Mitchum understood something that many celebrities never do. You don't have to reveal everything about yourself just because the public wants to know. He built a character around himself, and that character became one of the most famous images in American cinema. But the real Robert Mitchum was much more complicated. He was a survivor before he was a star, a writer before he was a leading man, a musician when people expected only a tough guy, and a deeply private man in an industry built around exposure. Perhaps that's why his stories still feel so surprising, because audiences thought they knew Robert Mitchum. They knew the voice, they knew the stare, they knew the slow walk and effortless attitude. But behind that image was a man who had spent his entire life making sure nobody could completely figure him out. And maybe that was the greatest role he ever played. So, what do you think about Robert Mitchum's stories? Which of his stories surprised you the most? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe.